Smoke drifted over the shattered valley like a silent memory of the war that had just passed. The ground was cracked and scarred from the heavy machines that had rolled through it. Broken weapons and twisted metal pieces were scattered in every direction. The sky was heavy with the scent of fire and dust and something deeper, the stillness that comes after something terrible has ended. And in the middle of that silence lay a figure who had once stood tall as a defender of her world. Her name was Lyra, and she had been one of the strongest warriors among her people, trained from the time she could walk, molded into a fighter who never surrendered and taught that death on the battlefield was the only true end for a warrior. But now she lay crumpled beside the blackened remains of a gunship, her armor cracked and bleeding, from wounds no one could count anymore. Her weapon had been lost in the chaos, her strength drained with each shallow breath she pulled into her tired lungs. Her vision flickered and faded as she looked up at the ruined sky. Her last battle had been a desperate one. She had fought alongside the last surviving members of her unit, trying to hold a collapsing defense line against the advancing human troops. The enemy had overwhelmed them, not with rage but with precision and cold resolve. Lyra had seen her comrades fall one by one, some shouting their last war cries, others just crumpling without sound. And in that moment, something inside her had broken, not her bones or her body, but something deeper, her will. She had never imagined herself surrendering, never thought she could feel so empty, and yet here she was unable to rise, unable to fight, waiting for the silence to claim her completely. She dragged herself toward the shelter of a broken wall half buried under a collapsed steel beam and leaned against it with trembling arms. Her breathing slowed and her heart weakened, and though the world around her was still burning, Lyra felt none of it. She closed her eyes, not out of peace but out of exhaustion and quiet pain. She had no hope, no strength, no reason left to survive. As the wind moved through the ruins, it carried the sound of distant voices, a language she could not understand, soft and echoing like whispers in a dream. She thought it was her mind playing tricks, maybe memories surfacing, or the last flicker of her fading consciousness. The light around her was starting to dim, not from the setting sun, but from the darkness behind her eyes, and even as her body struggled for breath, her thoughts grew still and silent. But there was movement not far from where she lay, a figure stepping carefully through the debris, scanning the ground, searching for something or someone. The figure paused when his device beeped softly, and he turned toward the wreckage where Lyra had collapsed moments ago. The man was human, dressed not in armor, but in a dusty field uniform marked with the symbol of a medical team. His name was Daniel, and he was not a soldier, not exactly just a medic trying to do what little he could in a world that had long stopped listening to kindness. Saw her lying there, unmoving, hidden beneath ash and steel, barely recognizable as anything still living. But the device did not lie, and his instincts screamed that something was still holding on. Without waiting for orders or approval, Daniel climbed over the wreckage, crouched beside her, and checked for breath. It was faint, barely there, but enough to matter, enough to try. Lyra did not know what was happening, her body too far gone to respond, her thoughts drowning in silence, but deep inside a fragile thread still remained that refused to snap. She felt hands lifting her, gently heard the sound of breathing, not her own, and a voice speaking calm words in a language she could not understand, but the tone was clear. It was not hate or anger, it was something else, something she had not heard in a long time. The world around her faded completely, and the last thing she saw was the face of a stranger. Above, her eyes filled not with fear or judgment, but with something softer before everything disappeared into darkness. And just like that, the warrior who had given up stopped falling, though she did not yet know why. The air inside the temporary medical station was thick with dust and silence, broken only by the steady hum of generators and the distant sound of transport ships moving across the sky. The facility had once been a school made of stone and steel, now turned into a field clinic, where injured civilians and wounded fighters were laid out on thin beds lined in rows. It was not much more than shelter, with basic equipment patched together with effort and urgency. The scent of antiseptic masked the sharper smell of blood and burnt cloth, and everything moved in a rhythm. Driven not by comfort, but by survival, Daniel moved quickly between the beds, carrying supplies and checking on patients, one after another, always keeping his focus sharp and his steps steady. He had learned not to stop, not to let the weight of the war settle too heavily on his shoulders. Every room he walked through held people who had lost something or someone, and he had taught himself to push through it, because there was no time for emotion when lives were slipping away. But today his thoughts were elsewhere, not on the injured boy with the broken leg or the old man with burns across his chest, but on the figure that lay in the quarantine room at the end of the hallway, far from the others, far from curious eyes and questioning voices. She had arrived last night, carried in his arms, unconscious, and fading, her body cold to the touch and barely clinging to life. An alien fighter, a being who only hours earlier might have killed any human who crossed her path, now lay silent behind a sealed door while machines worked to stabilize her vitals. Daniel had argued with the commanding officer when they first saw her body, demanding that they give her the same treatment as any other wounded, but suspicion had filled the room, and hesitation followed every word. "She's one of them. They said she would kill us if she could. She's dangerous and not worth the risk." But Daniel had not stepped back, had not left her side, and in the end, they gave him permission under strict orders to keep her separated from everyone else. He had stayed up most of the night, monitoring her condition, cleaning her wounds, and applying the healing gel to her cracked skin, unsure if she would make it till morning now. As he stepped into the room once more, he saw her eyes open, just barely. Narrow slits filled with confusion and pain, and something deeper, something cautious. She didn't move much, didn't speak, but he could see that she was awake, aware, and watching him with silent judgment. He greeted her softly, unsure if she understood his words, but speaking anyway because silence felt too heavy. His voice was low and calm as he explained what had happened, how he had found her and brought her here, how she was safe for now and under care, though he didn't know what would happen. Next, Lyra blinked slowly, her body too weak to respond. Her thoughts tangled in fog, but pieces of memory were returning, scattered fragments of fire and pain, and the moment her eyes had closed on the battlefield, she remembered the sound of footsteps and the strange touch that had lifted her from the ground, not rough or cruel, but gentle. Now she lay in an unfamiliar room with clean sheets and humming machines, surrounded by light instead of smoke. The man before her was human, yet he had not hurt her, not even when she was too weak to resist. She tried to speak, but her voice failed her, so she only stared, watching as he moved around the room, adjusting equipment, checking readings, and occasionally glancing at her with eyes that showed no fear. She didn't understand him, couldn't make sense of his kindness, but she watched and waited, and for the first time in many days, she felt a strange sensation in her chest. Not hope, not yet, but something close to wonder. Daniel saw the way she looked at him, the distrust mixed with curiosity, and he understood it well. He didn't expect her to trust him, not after what they had done to each other's people, but he believed that actions mattered more than words, and that sometimes mercy could speak louder than weapons. He didn't see her as a threat, not right now, not when she was barely breathing and full of wounds that marked not only her body but her spirit too. Over the next few hours he returned again and again, bringing water and soft food, helping her eat with slow, careful movements, never pushing, never rushing. She said nothing, made no sound, but he saw the way her fingers trembled when she reached for the cup, the way her eyes followed his hands as he adjusted the monitor beside her bed. Her breathing was steadier now, her pulse stronger, though she still couldn't sit up without pain. Outside the room, others whispered, asking why he was wasting time on an enemy, and he heard their doubts, felt their judgment, but he ignored it all. Because when he looked at her, he didn't see a soldier. He saw someone left behind, someone broken and forgotten, someone who had given up, not because she was weak, but because she had been alone for too long. So he stayed beside her, offering comfort and silence, doing what little he could not to fix her, because he wasn't sure she wanted that yet, but to remind Her that she was still alive, that someone had chosen not to leave her on that battlefield. And as the day turned to night, and the stars appeared above the ruins of the world they had nearly destroyed, Daniel sat beside the alien warrior who had given up, and though she said nothing, she no longer turned her face away. Time moved slowly. Within the walls of the medical shelter where the sounds of war were no longer present, but the echoes of it still lingered in the minds of those who walked its halls. For Lyra the days blurred together like dust carried in wind, and though she remained in silence, her body began to recover little by little under the quiet care of the one. She now watched closely the human called Daniel, whose name she had heard spoken by others who passed by the room, but never entered. He had become a familiar presence, not just a caretaker, but something more, something steady, something that refused to break even in the face of her sharp glances and silent rejection. Her body remained weak and her limbs ached with every motion. But the worst pain lay not in the wounds that had been bandaged or in the bruises that had begun to fade, but in the hollow space inside her that had grown so large she feared it would never close. She had lived her life for duty, for war, for survival, and now those things were gone, and in their place stood a strange human with no weapon in hand, no anger in his voice, and no fear in his gaze. Spoke to her every day, not about the war or about their past, but about the present small things, the changing weather, the shape of the clouds above the hills, the laughter of a child who had survived with burns on her arms and hope in her smile. At first, Lyra had listened only because she had no choice, but then something changed in her quiet thoughts, as if a door she had not noticed before had begun to crack open. His words were not commands, they were invitations, soft bridges stretching across the silence she had wrapped around herself like armor. Daniel brought her warm broth each morning and sat with her while she sipped it, slowly, her hands still trembling from weakness, but steadier than the day before. He adjusted her bedding when it slipped and made sure the light in the room never burned too bright. Sometimes he would read to her from old Earth books, and though she did not understand every word, she followed the rhythm of his voice and the way it softened when he read about rivers and forests and things she had never seen there. Were times she would look away, eyes narrowed, jaw clenched, as memories of her fallen comrades filled her chest and shame coiled around her heart like a serpent. She was supposed to be one of the elite, a warrior who did not break, and yet she had broken. She had closed her eyes and accepted death, while this human had chosen to drag her back from the edge. Without knowing her name or her history, she began to speak. One morning, a single word spoken in her language, not directed at him, but into the air, and Daniel had turned his head and answered softly, though he did not understand what she said. His answer was not a translation, but a gesture, a hand placed gently on the edge of her bed, a quiet signal that he heard her anyway. From that day, she began to speak more slowly, testing his language with effort, sometimes broken, sometimes clear. And though her tone was always firm, her words carried weight, and he listened to everyone. One evening, as the sun slipped below the ruined horizon, casting long golden shadows across the quiet camp, she asked him why. Why had he saved her? Why had he risked being called a traitor for an enemy? He looked at her for a long time before answering, and when he did, there was no hesitation in his voice. He told her that life mattered, that saving one life, even if it belonged to someone once called an enemy, was still worth the fight. He said that people were more than the sides they were born on, and that perhaps healing a single soul might one day help heal a world. Lyra had no words for him, then not because she did not understand, but because something inside her had cracked. Again, not with pain this time, but with warmth, like the first light of dawn after a long winter. She had been raised to see humans as the destroyers of her world, ruthless invaders who cared for nothing beyond control. But Daniel had shown her something different, something that could not be explained by training or reports or orders. He was not trying to win her over. He was not trying to convert her. He simply stayed, and in his staying he gave her something she had not felt since before the war had begun, the feeling that she was not alone. The days that followed, Lyra began to sit up on her own, began to move without support, and her eyes grew sharper, though the sadness had not left them. Daniel watched her progress without praise, without pressure, always near, but never overbearing, and in that careful balance. Trust began to grow, not loudly, not suddenly, but like roots beneath the soil, slowly reaching deeper with each passing day. Though Lyra said nothing of it, she began to believe that maybe her life had not ended on that battlefield. Maybe she had not been left behind, but instead had been found by someone who believed that broken things could still be mended, and so within that small, quiet room, far from the roar of battle, an enemy warrior and a human medic sat. Together, each carrying wounds the other could not see, but slowly, quietly beginning to heal. Quiet inside the medical shelter had grown heavy, not with peace, but with something harder to name, a slow shift in the air that made the staff glance over their shoulders and speak in low voices. Whispers moved through the rooms like wind in the grass, soft but sharp, carrying questions and doubts that refused to fade. Lyra noticed the change, though no one spoke directly to her. Their eyes said enough when they passed the hallway where her room remained closed. Their footsteps slowed just slightly, their words cut short when she was in sight. Daniel felt it too, though he pretended not to see it, moving through his work with steady hands and practiced calm, but inside his thoughts churned like a storm, trying to stay ahead of something he could not fully see. He had known from the beginning that keeping her there was a risk, one he was willing to take, but risks never stayed quiet forever, and now shadows were gathering around the decision he had made to save a life others wanted to forget. Reports had started coming in from nearby posts, messages laced with orders and warnings about dealing with captured enemy soldiers. There were rules now, stricter ones, decisions being made far above his rank, decisions that cared more about control than compassion. A new directive had been issued without warning, one that placed all remaining alien fighters under forced relocation to an isolated detention zone, and Lyra's name had been added to the list, even though she had done nothing but breathe and heal in silence. He had read the message twice, then a third time, hoping the words would change, but they remained cold and clear. She was to be transferred in 3 days, taken from the shelter, and placed in a camp beyond the mountain borders where no aid workers were allowed, no communication was permitted, and no future had ever come back from. It wasn't justice, it wasn't mercy, it was fear dressed as order, and Daniel could not ignore it. That night he sat outside her room, staring at the sealed door, his hands clasped together, his thoughts stretched thin between what was right and what was safe. He knew he couldn't tell her, not yet, not when her strength had just begun to return, but time was slipping away, and choices had to be made. When he entered the room, she looked up at him with those watchful eyes that missed nothing, and even though he smiled, she knew something was wrong. She didn't ask right away, choosing instead to sit quietly while he checked her pulse and adjusted the monitor and moved around with motions that felt too careful, too controlled. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but steady, asking if he had come to say goodbye. His breath caught for a moment, and he looked at her, unsure of what to say, because she already knew the truth, or at least enough of it to see through his silence. Told her everything, not with excuses, but with the weight it carried. He told her that decisions had been made above them, and that people in power feared what they did not understand, and that she had become a symbol to them, not a person, just a problem to be moved far away. He explained what the camp was, what it meant, and how nothing good waited for her there. When he finished, she sat still, her hands resting on the blanket, her face unreadable, but her eyes full of something that looked like acceptance. She said she had expected this, that her kind were never meant to be shown mercy, and that even kindness had limits in a world broken by war. She thanked him for what he had done, for the time he had given her, and for the small space of safety he had built around her, even if it was always meant to end. He listened to her words, felt the quiet strength in them, and then he said, "No, not yet, not like this." Daniel told her that he had a plan, not a perfect one, not even a safe one, but something better than waiting for a cage. There was a place beyond the hills where other survivors had gathered, people from both sides, who no longer believed in the war and had chosen to build something new, hidden from the systems that wanted to erase them. He said he could get her there. If she trusted him, if she still wanted to live at. First she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the window, as if measuring the distance between hope and disappointment. Then she asked why again, not out of doubt, but to hear his reason one last time. He looked at her with tired eyes and said, "Because you're alive, and I won't let that be taken away. Not by fear, not by rules, not by anyone who never looked into your eyes." They began to plan in whispers, timing their words with the passing footsteps outside the door, hiding maps under blankets, and marking routes in pieces of cloth. Lyra asked for a blade not to attack, but to protect, and he gave her one wrapped in old bandages so no one would notice. They moved carefully, quietly watching every door and memorizing every guard's pattern. The final night arrived heavy with silence, as if the building itself knew what was coming. Lyra dressed slowly, every movement sharp, and controlled her body, still healing but ready. Daniel carried supplies in a small pack medical, Kit's food compressed into ration bars, and an old link powered by a cracked battery. The plan was simple, but the path was not for the way out would take them. Through checkpoints and sensor zones, where any mistake could end it all before it. Even began as they stood at the back door, waiting for the last patrol to pass. She looked at him one more time. Not as a human, not as a rescuer, but as something harder to name, someone who had walked beside her when no one else dared. She nodded once, and he returned it. Then they stepped into the dark, not as enemies, not as strangers, but as two lives bound by something stronger than war. The night stretched across the hills like a heavy blanket, hiding everything beneath its thick shadows, while a cold wind swept through the broken trees and scattered dust across the empty roads. Lyra and Daniel moved through the silence with careful steps, their breaths low, their eyes sharp, every motion weighed with the knowledge that discovery meant the end of everything they had fought to hold on to. The stars above offered no comfort, only pale light that flickered against the darkness, as if unsure of its place in a world still torn by war and fear. Lyra's feet pressed against the uneven ground, every step sending sparks of pain through her legs, but she did not slow. She did not speak, only moved forward with the quiet resolve of someone who had already faced death and now walked beyond it. Daniel stayed close beside her, holding the pack that carried their supplies, one hand always near. The small link he had managed to repair using spare parts and stubborn will. Their route had been planned with care, every path chosen to avoid patrols, every movement timed between security sweeps and motion scanners. But even careful plans could crumble when the world refused to stay quiet. They had almost cleared the outer perimeter of the camp when a low hum broke the stillness, the sound of a drone hovering above, its red light cutting through the night like a warning shot. Lyra grabbed Daniel's arm and pulled him into the trees there. Backs pressed against the rough bark while the drone passed overhead, scanning the terrain with mechanical patience. Neither of them breathed until the sound faded and the light disappeared into the distance, replaced once again by the soft rustle of leaves and the steady pulse of the earth beneath their feet as they crossed the last checkpoint near the valley's edge. They encountered a pair of guards, too close, too fast, and without a clear path around. Lyra acted before words could form, moving like a shadow, stepping behind the first man and pressing the edge of her blade against his throat before he could reach for his weapon. Daniel stepped forward, disarming the second with trembling hands, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing what was at stake. They tied both men with straps pulled from the medkit, gagged them gently, and placed them under the cover of old foliage, not out of cruelty, but because time offered no space for mercy or regret. Their journey continued across rocky fields and shallow streams, through cold winds and silence broken only by the distant thunder of transport ships moving along the upper skies. Hours passed with no words shared, but much felt, every glance between them carrying thoughts they no longer needed to speak. Lyra's movements were slower, now the effort beginning to show, her body still recovering, but her eyes were sharp and her spirit unbroken, no longer the same warrior who had once waited for death in the shadow of steel and fire. When the mountains finally came into view, their sharp peaks rising against the early light of dawn, Daniel felt a wave of relief pass through his chest. Not yet safe, but close enough to believe that hope could be more than just a whisper. He activated the comlink, sending out the coded signal that would reach the outpost hidden within the canyon, a place built by deserters, survivors, and those who had chosen peace over vengeance. People like them who no longer believed in sides, or borders, or the lies of those who had sent them to fight. Reply came quickly, a static-filled voice giving them coordinates and instructions, and Lyra's steps grew stronger with each passing second, her breath heavier, but her pace faster, drawn towards something she had not let herself imagine for so long. A place not built for warriors or prisoners, but for those still willing to rebuild something from the ashes. When they reached the edge of the outpost, Daniel collapsed to one knee, his strength finally giving way after days of running and hiding, and carrying the weight of his choice. Lyra knelt beside him, placed a hand on his shoulder, and helped him rise, both of them supported now not by duty or mission, but by the bond formed in silence and trust. The outpost welcomed them without questions, the guards recognizing the signal and waving them through into a world quiet and warm in a way neither of them had known for a long time. Inside the walls, there were humans and aliens alike working together, planting crops, repairing buildings, laughing in small groups, and carrying tools instead of weapons. No one looked at Lyra with fear. No one questioned Daniel's decision. Instead, they saw only two people who had made it through the storming. The days that followed, Daniel rested his wounds, treated with care by healers who asked for no explanation. And Lyra began to walk among the fields, her steps slow but steady, her mind full of memories and questions, and something that felt like a beginning. She watched the sun rise over the valley, saw children running barefoot through the grass herd. Music played on strange instruments, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she allowed herself to smile, not for others, not for survival, but for herself. She found Daniel sitting under the shade of a tree, watching the sky with quiet eyes, and sat beside him without a word, their silence now comfortable, not heavy. And after a long pause, she turned toward him and said she had always believed that strength came from fighting, from never yielding, from standing alone against whatever tried to break you. He looked at her, smiled with tired eyes, and told her that real strength came from knowing when to keep going and when to reach out for help, and that sometimes surviving was the strongest act of all. As the sky turned gold and the wind moved gently through the leaves above them, they sat together, not as enemies, not as symbols, but as people who had once been lost and had chosen to be found again. And so the warrior who had once closed her eyes to die now watched the world awaken around her, carried not by fate but by a human who refused to let her go. The end.